The camera opens on a dense, mist-shrouded forest in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. There is a young woman, framed perfectly against the rough-hewn timber of a tiny cabin. She is hauling water, chopping wood, and living what appears to be a life of profound, untouched isolation. This is the visual signature of Isabelle Paige, a creator who built an empire on the promise of the digital pastoral. But in early 2026, the lens shifted. The rough-hewn timber was replaced by the high ceilings of a modern, professionally constructed Dreamhouse. The quiet isolation was fractured by questions from an audience who realized the wilderness they had been watching for years was located just a short walk from a multi-million-dollar family estate. The story of Isabelle Paige is not just about a woman building a cabin in the woods. It is a masterclass in modern storytelling, a complex negotiation between the desire for authentic, simple living and the highly lucrative reality of lifestyle branding. Over the past several years, Paige has navigated an intense journey from a minimalist yoga practitioner living in a van to the central icon of the Cottagecore movement, commanding an audience of nearly 1 million subscribers. Her trajectory forces us to look closely at the tension between lived reality and cinematic curation. We are going to explore the architecture of her brand, the controversial timeline of her personal life, and the recent dramatic shifts in her public persona that have brought her to a critical turning point.
To understand the monumental shift happening in 2026, we have to look at the foundation of the Isabelle Paige narrative. Her early life was defined by a restless search for spiritual and physical grounding. Long before the tiny house existed, she was a global nomad. She traveled to India, living in an ashram and earning high-ranking yoga certifications. She spent time in Australia and New Zealand, absorbing different cultures and ways of moving through the world. During a brief stint in Hawaii, she lived secretly in a van while attending school. These years were a crash course in self-reliance. They provided the raw material, the philosophical vocabulary, and the practical survival skills that would later define her digital persona. When she returned from Asia, she made a decisive commitment. She was going to live on her parents' land in the mountains of Washington state. The story she told her early audience was one of sheer grit. She worked a minimum wage job, she saved every single tip she earned. She poured all of that meager income into purchasing the materials to build her first tiny house. This narrative was incredibly powerful. It bonded her instantly to a generation of viewers who felt suffocated by modern consumerism. Here was a young woman rejecting the traditional path, choosing instead to build a life with her own hands, using manual tools, driven by a philosophy of extreme minimalism. But the reality of that land in Washington state adds a crucial layer of complexity to the self-made narrative. The property was not a random plot of wilderness she purchased with waitressing tips. It was a family-owned parcel.
Her parents had previously operated a cannabis farm on the site, a venture that was eventually discontinued when it failed to turn a profit. The family is quite well off, owning property both in the mountains and in the city. Her father, Dave Paige, has a background that provided a significant safety net. While Isabelle absolutely performed intense physical labor, she was not entirely alone in the wilderness. Her brother also began building a tiny home on the same family land. It was less a solitary retreat and more a coordinated family project. The urgency to build her own tiny house was partly driven by the conditions of the older family cabin she initially stayed in, which she documented as being infested with ants. She used this uncomfortable reality to heighten the dramatic stakes of her videos, creating a compelling reason for her to finish her tiny sanctuary as quickly as possible. This was the first iteration of the Isabelle Paige brand. Rustic, functional, space-limited, and deeply appealing in its portrayed simplicity.
As the channel grew, the aesthetic evolved. The stark minimalism began to soften, making way for a highly curated, deeply romanticized version of country life. This shift was catalyzed by the introduction of a central pillar in the Isabelle Paige story, her relationship with Logan Bowen. Bowen, a musician from Alabama who performs under the moniker The National Forest, entered the picture around 2022. He is a fiercely independent DIY artist, handling his own vocals, instrumentals, mixing, and mastering. His music, featuring rustic indie folk acoustic tracks like Don't Go Away and Just Knowing You, became the heartbeat of her channel. The synergy? was perfect. Her cinematic, slow-living visuals paired seamlessly with his nostalgic acoustic sound. They created a unified brand experience that was intoxicating for viewers. With Bowden's arrival, the content shifted dramatically. The narrative of the fiercely independent, solitary woman transforming the wilderness gave way to something that closely resembled the trad wife aesthetic. The tiny house was redesigned. It was filled with more appliances, more specialized props, and a warmer, more domestic focus. They were building a life together, and the audience was invited to watch every idyllic moment. In the summer of 2024, the relationship reached its apparent pinnacle. Paige posted a video titled, "It Finally Happened," documenting a beautiful ceremony. The audience celebrated what appeared to be a stunning, intimate mountain wedding, but almost as quickly as the romantic peak was reached, the cracks began to show. By early 2025, the wedding video was quietly deleted, only to be re-uploaded later.
Viewers noticed that Paige was no longer wearing a wedding ring in her updates. The ambiguity became a massive point of contention. Even after the ceremony, Paige continued to refer to Bowden as her boyfriend or partner rather than her husband. The community was left confused, speculating whether the wedding had been a legally binding marriage, a purely symbolic union, or, as the most cynical critics suggested, a staged event designed to generate views and capitalize on the romance of their combined aesthetic. The speculation reached a boiling point in mid-2025. Roughly 9 months prior to April 2026, Paige released a video officially confirming the breakup. She kept the details vague, attributing the split to the natural dissolution of a relationship and expressing a profound sense of feeling lost. Bowden moved back to his hometown, and the shared dream of the mountain homestead was fractured. The audience, heavily invested in the romance, demanded answers that Paige was not willing to give. But the silence was broken by Bowden's art. In June 2025, he released a song titled "Up the River." The lyrics were sharp, pointing to deep betrayals. They suggested he had been lied to while he was away from the mountain. This musical release acted as a catalyst for intense rumors within the YouTube drama community, with many speculating that infidelity had played a role in the collapse of the relationship. Paige never directly addressed the lyrics, choosing instead to focus her content on the emotional fallout. The late 2025 and early 2026 videos documented a period of intense, almost suffocating isolation. She filmed solo trips, capturing her tears and her struggles to find meaning in the wake of the separation. The music changed. The tone shifted from warm, collaborative domesticity to stark, melancholic survival. The audience watched as she navigated the harsh winter of the Cascade Mountains alone, seemingly battling both the elements and her own internal grief. But as viewers analyzed these emotional videos, a new wave of scrutiny began to emerge. The focus shifted from her romantic life back to the very foundation of her channel, the authenticity of her isolation.
Magic of Isabelle Paige's content has always relied on the illusion of seclusion. The camera frames her tiny house against endless pines, suggesting a life lived miles from civilization. But the internet is relentless, and investigators within the community began to map her geographic reality. They discovered that the tiny house is not an isolated outpost. It is situated within walking distance from her family's main, fully equipped house. The property is accessible and visible on Google Street View. The quiet, idyllic river where Paige is frequently filmed bathing and swimming sits just below a road. This is not a forgotten logging trail. It is a road busy enough that cars can occasionally be spotted passing in the extreme background of her shots. The framing required to exclude these modern intrusions is incredibly deliberate. Critics began to describe her technique as a Copperfieldian visual sleight of hand. She is not simply documenting a rugged life, she is a skilled cinematographer, crafting a highly specific, fictionalized atmosphere. She actively frames out the electric poles, the neighboring structures, and the paved roads to maintain the brand's core promise of a wilderness retreat. This revelation deepened the controversy surrounding her socioeconomic status. The self-made, waitressing to build a cabin narrative was sharply contrasted with the reality of living on a family estate with significant resources. She had access to a full kitchen, a modern bathroom, and a support system just a few hundred feet away. The tiny house, for all its rustic charm, functioned more like a specialized film set than a desperate survival shelter.
This does not erase the hard work she put into building it, but it fundamentally changes the context. The audience realized they were watching a choice born of privilege, not a necessity born of circumstance. The tension between the humble brand image and the underlying wealth became a permanent fixture in the discourse surrounding her channel.
As the geographic illusions were being deconstructed, Paige made a decision that further challenged her naturalist brand. She openly documented her physical transformation through rhinoplasty. She chose to have the surgery with Mr. Hamadi in the Transform Clinic in the United Kingdom, traveling internationally during the COVID-19 pandemic. She explained her choice with raw vulnerability, stating that she had been deeply insecure about her nose since she was 13 years old. The insecurity had severely impacted her mental health and her willingness to be photographed. Despite the isolation of having the procedure during a global lockdown, unable to have family with her at the hospital, she expressed immense relief and satisfaction. She called it the best thing she had ever done for herself. The reaction from her audience was entirely fractured. A significant portion praised her transparency, appreciating the honesty about body image struggles that plague so many women. But another, highly vocal segment felt betrayed. The surgery, paired with a noticeable shift toward wearing expensive, high-end clothing brands like Reformation, seemed entirely antithetical to the minimalist self-acceptance ethos she had preached for years. Some viewers argued that the physical changes, combined with her increasingly somber demeanor, made her appear disconnected from her original values. Furthermore, the logistical execution of the surgery sparked another layer of criticism regarding her timeline management. Viewers realized that she had pre-recorded and scheduled a backlog of videos to cover the period she was away in the city, recovering.
On the channel, it appeared as though she had never left the snowy isolation of the tiny house. When the truth emerged, it reinforced the growing sentiment that her content was highly calculated. The organic, day-to-day documentary style was an illusion. The channel was a managed production, scheduled and released to maintain a specific narrative flow, regardless of what was actually happening in her life.
The manipulation of time became a recurring theme, eroding the trust of her most detail-oriented viewers. A glaring example occurred in the winter of 2025, leading into 2026. Paige posted content leading up to Christmas, showing her happily baking and preparing numerous gifts in the cabin, suggesting she was getting ready to host or visit a large group of family and friends. Then, in a video published on January 4th, 2026, the narrative abruptly shifted. She looked into the camera and stated she had been alone for weeks. She claimed the intense isolation was breaking her down, prompting her to take a spontaneous week-long solo trip to a seaside cabin to find inspiration for her upcoming book. The math simply did not work. If she realized the need for the trip after the new year, traveled to the coast, spent a full week there, and then edited the footage, it was logistically impossible for that video to be live on YouTube by January 4th. This glaring discrepancy confirmed what many had suspected. The emotional arcs of her videos were being constructed in the edit bay, completely detached from the literal calendar. While pre-recording and nonlinear editing are standard practices in traditional filmmaking, they violate the core contract of the lifestyle vlog. The audience expects a certain degree of real-time honesty. They want to know that when a creator is crying on screen about being lonely today, they are actually lonely today. The realization that Paige was using specific dates in emotional displays to engineer a false sense of reality led critics to accuse her of acting.
The genuine moments of distress began to feel like scripted beats in a continuous, meticulously directed drama.
Despite the mounting scrutiny over authenticity and timelines, the Isabelle Paige brand was becoming too massive to be contained by a tiny house and YouTube ad revenue. As she approached 1 million subscribers, she needed to diversify. In late 2025, she made a decisive move into high-end, in-person experiences. She launched the Authentica Residency, an exclusive retreat held in the redwoods of Mendocino, California. Co-hosted with another creator named Leone, the residency was explicitly marketed as a journey of reflection, healing, and connection. This was the ultimate commodification of the Isabelle Paige aesthetic. For a staggering $2,800, attendees could spend the New Year transition from December 29, 2025 to January 2, 2026, living out a curated version of her brand. The price included shared cabin lodging, 3 vegan meals a day, and workshops designed to help participants align with what truly matters. She was no longer just a woman surviving in the woods. She had positioned herself as a spiritual and lifestyle guide for others. The reaction was swift and critical. Many longtime viewers called the retreat wildly overpriced, accusing her of exploiting a parasocial relationship and targeting a gullible audience desperate to purchase a piece of her perceived peace. Yet, despite the backlash, the Authentica residency sold out completely. This success proved a crucial point. Her controversies did not diminish her influence. In fact, her transition from the grind of weekly video production to hosting premium high-ticket retreats is a classic evolution for top-tier influencers. It stabilizes income and elevates the creator from a subject to an authority.
She was capitalizing on the very lifestyle she had spent years projecting, turning the digital pastoral into a tangible and highly profitable luxury product. All of these shifts, the breakup, the surgery, the retreats, the unmasking of the timeline, culminated in the architectural transition of early 2026. The tiny house era was officially ending. On February 22, 2026, she released Building My Dream House in the Mountains. This was followed by the Empty House Tour on March 8th and a deeply reflective video titled Things Are Changing on April 5th. Paige was leaving the rustic, cramped quarters of the self-built cabin for a sprawling modern residence on the same family property. This new building features high ceilings, a modern cottage fusion aesthetic, specialized craft and sewing areas, and a garage. It was constructed with professional assistance and family-supported infrastructure, a stark departure from the manual tools and waitressing budget of her origins. The videos suggest that this new space, which functions as both a residence and a high-end production studio, had actually been in development or at least used for filming and sewing since 2024 or 2025. It had simply been kept off camera until the narrative demanded a new beginning. This represents a massive second-order shift in her influencer strategy. She has moved entirely from struggle-based content to curation-based content. The Dreamhouse is the ultimate physical manifestation of the cottagecore image, scrubbed clean of the dirt, the ants, and the bitter cold of the original tiny house. But by moving into this expansive, modern structure, she has effectively destroyed the false sense of isolation that made her famous. The Copperfieldian framing will be nearly impossible to maintain as her physical footprint expands.
She is attempting to reconcile the brand's commitment to simple living with the undeniable reality of her wealth and professional success.
As of the spring of 2026, Isabelle Paige is standing in the center of her new, immaculate studio, trying to weave the threads of her past into a sustainable future. The Things Are Changing era is an attempt to close the book on the Logan Bowen years and the tiny house struggles simultaneously. She is focusing on her upcoming book, her residencies, and evolving her story format into something that closely resembles high-end documentary filmmaking. By abandoning the pretense of minimum-wage self-sufficiency and fully embracing her reality as a successful, affluent artist, she is taking a massive risk. She may find a brand identity that is far more honest and sustainable, but she risks permanently alienating the core audience that tuned in to watch a young woman fight for survival in a small wooden box. Isabelle Paige remains one of the most fascinating and polarizing figures in the digital pastoral landscape. Her technical mastery of the camera and her deep understanding of our collective desire for a quieter, more meaningful life have built an empire. But the endless controversies over her family's land, her relationship timelines, and her curated isolation expose the brutal difficulty of maintaining an authentic self in a world that demands continuous, perfect performance. The dream house is built, the tiny house is empty, and the story is forced to change. If you found this exploration of digital storytelling and the reality of influencer culture compelling, send this episode to a friend who is fascinated by the architecture of online personas.